Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. It's always a great privilege for me to be in an academic institution, particularly one as distinguished here as Ashland. I had a very long and very undistinguished college career, and after about 6 or 7 years, I think I finally had accumulated enough units to get thrown out, and have never been as unhappy since. What I would like to do today, if you don't mind, is obviously not get into the predicting stage with a little more than 3.5 weeks left to go in the campaign. I'd like to talk a little bit about where I see it, though, and try and give you an analysis of what's worked and what hasn't worked. I'm sort of reminded of Yogi Berra, who used to always say he's not very good about predictions, especially about the future. And I think today would not be a good day to anoint Bill Clinton president, although as a survey of the Bush campaign leadership that was in the Washington Post anonymously over the weekend, they described their chances as possible but not probable. And certainly with all the polls showing the president trailing anywhere from 12 to 15 points, he certainly has a very uphill battle. This political season, I've been around politics for about 30 years, and not quite as long as my very, very great and distinguished friend Cliff White, on whose behalf I'm here today, and certainly we all wish him a very speedy recovery from a very lingering illness. But what a tremendous man he is, and what a great job he's done with the Ashbrook Center here. He has so many friends around this country, and I know that we all, our hearts and our prayers go out to him and his lovely wife for quick and speedy recovery. I first came to the Ashbrook Institute a number of years ago when President Reagan dedicated the Institute. It was in 1983, and obviously had very fond memories of the late Congressman, such an outstanding individual who obviously was the inspiration for the Institute, and I think it's just a great asset to this university. But in those 30 years of politics, a little less than Cliff, but not too many less than Cliff, I've never quite seen the mood or the environment as angry or as unhappy as the voters are in this election cycle. I'm a little reminded of 1988. I was Jack Kemp's chairman, and we were in New Hampshire, as every presidential candidate spends a far disproportionate amount of time in New Hampshire and Iowa. But we were in New Hampshire, and I was watching this little old lady in a schoolyard one day, and she was sitting on a bench, and I always tried to go over and talk to the people who've been around, and I said, ma'am, how many presidential candidates have you met? She goes, all of them. And I said, well, how many have you met today? She goes, 8. And I said, well, who are you going to vote for? She said, I never vote. She said, it only encourages them. To a certain extent, that's where I think the American electorate is in this election cycle, and certainly 12 months ago, when Bill Clinton entered the race, 12 months ago this weekend, he did so against the advice and counsel of nearly every one of his advisors. They told him it was an exercise in folly, that George Bush was going to be reelected. As someone who had run a campaign that had won the largest electoral vote in history and won 49 states, I was very concerned a year ago that Bush was going to win all 50 states. And it just goes to show what a significant difference a year in American politics can make. But I think, unfortunately, Clinton entered that race as an underdog, went through some early challenges that probably would have finished off a lesser candidate, and survived, and now is on the brink of being the next president of the United States. And obviously, he would have to be viewed today as not only the front runner, but certainly without any significant mistakes in the next few weeks, the odds-on favorite. President Bush, obviously a year ago, having led this nation so very effectively through the Gulf War, having been a superb foreign policy president, having been the most popular president in the history of modern polls, certainly was anticipating his reelection and probably a coronation. And maybe that's why we're where we are today. George Bush and his people, I think, didn't anticipate the changes that were going on in America, particularly on the economic domestic front. And Bill Clinton, who'd been a candidate who's run for office every 2 years since 1974, was very well aware of the changes that were taking place in this country and put together a staff of probably some of the better political strategists that I've seen in my lifetime, and obviously charted a course that has us 3.5 weeks from an election, leading by the most significant margin any Democrats had since Lyndon Johnson's defeat of Barry Goldwater in 1964. The debates beginning on Sunday, more debates than we've ever had in a shorter span of time, three-way debates, obviously give Bush one last opportunity to make the American public refocus on not only the kind of president he has been, but hopefully on the kind of president that he will be in a second term. And that's really what this election is all about. This is not where you were 20 years ago when you went on college vacations. This is not what you did in the war in Vietnam. This is not where the country was 4 years ago. This is an election that clearly is about where is this country going to be 4 years from now and who's going to bring us most effectively to that point in time. The American public is frustrated. Historically, they have felt that government didn't relate to their problems. And I think in the last 2 years, they have become more and more frustrated, not only with the problems facing this great country, not only is our continued role in a new emerging world in which we truly are the only superpower, but does our political system really function effectively? And can those who represent us in Washington at both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue relate to the concerns of the average American? The 102nd Congress is in the process of adjourning. The House of Representatives went home yesterday. The Senate will probably go home in the next couple days. And I think if the American public had their way, they could stay home. I think you're going to see as traumatic an election cycle for members of Congress as you ever have. Already there's over 90 members of Congress who will not be returning, a record modern high, post-World War II high. And the likelihood is that the numbers will even increase and we could have as many as 125, 150 new members coming to Congress. In the undercurrent of a presidential race, a lot of that is getting lost, but the mood of the American public has been contributed to by a lot of the activity or inactivity that's gone on in probably one of the poorest producing Congresses that we've seen in modern times. 2 years ago, when the election was held, in the post-breaking of the President's pledge, there was a real mood of anger in the country that was just beginning. And instead of a lot of members of Congress being defeated, a lot of members of Congress got real scares. They came back after that election. Some had had close elections, some friends had actually lost who didn't anticipate losing, and they came back to Washington with sort of the wrath of the voters in their mind, and many who had very significant victories in the past found themselves winning narrowly. Obviously, the average of all members of Congress dropped off in their vote. So they started looking at the electorate a little differently. Many of them went out and hired pollsters who'd never had pollsters before, discovered when they took polls what they didn't want to hear, which was the American public didn't like them very much, decided they would go home and start holding town meetings to hear from the people in person. And what they heard is the people didn't like them very much. So they quickly hurried back to Washington, and unable to do what they normally did, which was every break go out of town on a junket, because when they went out of town on a junket, Primetime Live or 2020 or 60 Minutes was there with a hidden camera to film them. They were all sort of trapped in Washington, hanging around the floor of the Congress, talking about what a lousy job they had. So obviously if they had such a lousy job, the only thing they could do is raise their pay, which obviously threw gasoline on the fire. So this mood in the country and this mood of the Congress is really creating, I think, so much of this environment. Equally as important, you combine that, this anger that the political system was not facing up to its responsibilities on education and rebuilding the infrastructure or getting the economy moving again. We had a president that obviously, who had had this great success on the foreign policy arena, who didn't focus on the economy, wasn't as interested, obviously, in that agenda, and all of a sudden, I think, got caught in a much tougher race than he anticipated. I think what happened to the president and his people is they assumed we could have a rerun of Dukakis II, 1988. Same kind of a scenario, governor from a small state, even though Clinton is perceived as more moderate than Dukakis, would be able to go out and run the same kind of an election. Unfortunately for the president, the American public didn't want that kind of an election. There was a bad taste in their mouth from 1988. It was not a particularly pretty election. It was not an election that obviously there were any great lessons learned or any great mandate or any great agenda laid out before the American public. It was a lousy campaign run by George Bush against a lousier campaign run by Michael Dukakis. But I think the president has a tendency to categorize things and compartmentalize things, and he sees governance different from campaigning. So when he made a statement a few months ago, "I'll do anything to win," I think he was getting himself back into his election mode. This is not the kind of a campaign George Bush or Jim Baker liked to run. But I think they found themselves in a situation where they couldn't go defend their record on the economy and other things that they should have defended themselves on. And they decided they were going to take Bill Clinton out at the knees. And we went through a period where everybody was running as Harry Truman. Clinton, who obviously is the heir to the party of Harry Truman, Ross Perot has sort of the personality of Harry Truman, and George Bush, who wanted to come from behind victory like Harry Truman. I was very concerned there was going to be a great write-in vote for Tom Dewey if they continued. But needless to say, instead of talking about where this country needs to be 4 years from now, the president and his people decided we're going to take Bill Clinton out, we're going to raise all the allegations, and we're going to raise issues that to the American public today are not very relevant. Obviously, he has 3.5 weeks to try and change that agenda. But this is an election cycle very much like 1980, and there's always a temptation of those of us that have been around many campaigns to say, is this one like 72 or 80 or 84 or 88 or 76, or in Cliff White's case, 48 or 44. The bottom line being that this is an election like none other. But there is a parallel to 1980, and the parallel is that a large segment of the American public want change. 60% of the American public had made up their mind very early. They didn't want Jimmy Carter as president. They couldn't find an acceptable alternative initially. They had serious doubts about Ronald Reagan, which obviously have long been put to rest. In the course of the campaign and by the final debate, they were totally put to rest, and Reagan went on to his great victory. In this particular election, early on, people had some serious doubts that George Bush, a very decent man, a man who obviously had led the country effectively in foreign policy, just didn't get what was going on in the country. They felt he and his people were out of touch with the ordinary needs of the ordinary people. And I think that where Bush, if he loses this election, historians will look back, and the LA riots were the missed opportunity. George Bush was given the domestic agenda back on his plate, and he clearly could have driven the American dialogue on what we had to do as a nation very effectively at a time that Bill Clinton was a diminished candidate and Ross Perot's candidacy hadn't even begun. The Perot phenomenon, which was an early phenomenon, I don't think it's a phenomenon today, it's a curiosity today, but the Perot phenomenon was clearly something that came about because the American public had a view of who their two candidates were going to be very early, probably as early as we've ever had in a presidential campaign. Once Bill Clinton got through his allegations about marital infidelity and draft dodging, and the one that I thought was the real killer, the one that I was convinced was going to do him in, not inhaling dope when he was in college. I was convinced he was going to lose a whole generation of young people for wasting good dope. But obviously he was able to overcome that burden also. But the bottom line is that Clinton, I think, became, the American public saw Clinton and Bush as the alternatives. And polls in April, May said that 65% of the American public were not satisfied with their choices. Perot obviously jumped into that forum. There was a great movement across this country, unlike any I've ever seen. It really could have been the second political revolution. Obviously, Ross Perot didn't have the temperament to be a presidential candidate, and he probably didn't have the temperament to be a president. But the bottom line is this great movement was there, and Americans, many Americans, wonderful Americans who wanted to change the political system for the good, were there, obviously, at his disposal. When Perot dropped out of the race, I think what happened is it was the time that Clinton was coming back people took a second look at Bill Clinton at his convention, and obviously he became an acceptable alternative to Bush, and he's been leading in the polls ever since. He's now 13, 14 weeks. His poll numbers are very significant, and there hasn't been much movement. And in order for the president to turn this around, he has to once again convince voters not that he's the vehicle of change, which I always thought was an absurd premise for someone that's been in Washington for 12 years as vice president and president to run as the candidate of change. But what he has to convince voters, and the time may be too short to do that, is he had to convince voters that he had the capacity to change. He had the capacity to change his administration. He had the capacity to focus on issues that mattered to Americans. In the 3.5 weeks that are left, I certainly would hope that both candidates, and obviously Ross Perot's reentrance is not as a serious candidate, but as someone who obviously can raise some significant issues. I would hope in the last 3 weeks of this campaign that the American public will get a view of two visions of where this country needs to go. I've heard all that I want to hear about Bill Clinton's allegations. I don't care what he did in Moscow when he was a college student, and I'm sure the vast majority of Americans don't either. I want to hear where this country is going to be going in the next 4 years. And I think this election can come down to one or three things. It can either be an election of hope, in which Bill Clinton argues his view of America and George Bush argues his view of America, and Americans go out and make a positive vote, or it can end up continuing on the process that it's on, in which two men or three men stand there and try and destroy each other, and destroy each other's characters and everybody in each other's party, and end up where voters go in and vote for the lesser of three evils, a vote of anger, or even worse, a vote of apathy. I've had the privilege the last couple of years of traveling the world as part of U.S. delegations to watch elections in some of these new emerging democracies. And I can't tell you what a privilege it is to go and watch people who talk about America and talk about us being the beacon of democracy, and talk about during their periods of suppression that they would have sneaked into their meetings copies of our Constitution and the writings of some of our great American leaders, and that when they come here, the leaders of these new democracies, when they come to this country and address our Congress, as Walesa and some of these have, they quote our words, they quote Lincoln, they quote Jefferson. But I've gone and I've watched these people stand in line for 6, 8, 10 hours to vote, stand in lines that we wouldn't ever think of getting in for $100 bills. And at the same time, we have an American political process that is the model to the world. We're the only nation that exports democracy. Japanese don't export democracy. The Germans don't export democracies. We export democracy because we have believed in our system. I was at a dinner recently honoring the President of Hungary, and it was in the rotunda of the National Archives. And behind the Hungarian president were three documents: our Declaration of Independence, our Bill of Rights, and our Constitution. And as he stood there and he talked about in the history of Hungary, the long, many, many centuries of the history of Hungary, he was the first democratically elected president. Every single one of our presidents has been democratically elected. And whether George Bush is reelected or whether Bill Clinton becomes the 42nd president, every single president, the baton of freedom and democracy has been passed on generation to generation. I had the privilege of meeting Lech Walesa a couple years ago. It was the late Lee Atwater and I were sitting next to each other, and as we were coming down the elevator, he told a wonderful story, which I will share with you. But I was saying to Lee, I said, you know, I've been in politics all my life. I said, I have taken on presidents, sometimes even presidents of my own party. I've taken on speakers. I've now taken on billionaires. And I said, I have never, ever been threatened in my life. I've never had anybody send me a nasty note. I've never had anybody punch me in the face. I've never had anybody threaten me. Lech Walesa, in this lunch that we were in, was telling the story of how he first got involved in politics. And I was very fascinated because I'm the son and grandson of an electrician. My grandfather, my father, all my uncles, all my cousins are electricians. My father insisted I go to academia, go to college. I was the first one in my generation to do so, which now means I have to pay $125 an hour for an electrician to come fix a plug in my house. But I was always fascinated with Lech Walesa because he was a shipyard electrician, which is what my father was. And I always tried to think of my father. How would my father ever become a leader of a country or president of a movement? And I asked him this question. I said, Mr. President, how did you get started, and why did you get started, and what kind of a government do you envision having as this was right after you'd been elected president. He was addressing the Congress. And he has a great sense of humor. And he just turned to me, and I'll never forget this story because it's so very meaningful when you think about American politics. He said to me, he said, in 1980, he said, I worked very, very hard. He said, I had 4 children to feed. And he said, we were working 6, 7 days in the shipyard, and there never was enough food for my children. And every day I would go to work with the cries of my children being hungry, and every day I would come home, and the last words from my wife were tears of my children were hungry. He said, so I started complaining in the shipyard, and many of my fellow workers started to complain also that we weren't being paid enough. The leaders of the shipyard, the guards, came and they threw me out. They fired me. They threw me out of the gates. And he said, all my friends there started yelling my name, Lech, Lech, come back, come back. And he said, like a fool, he said, I started to climb this 12-foot cyclone fence to get back in the shipyard. And the guards aimed their guns at me, and I didn't know whether they were going to shoot me. I didn't know what they would do to me when I got to the other side. But for some reason, the cries of my fellow workers to climb that fence and come back was what drove me on. He said, well, for that act of foolishness, when I got back in the yard, my fellow workers said, we have to organize, you're our leader. That was the beginning of solidarity. He said, in the course of the next 10 years, I was imprisoned. I was threatened with death. I never knew whether I was ever going to see my family. He said, but I continually thought about America and the America that I'd heard of and the democracy. He said, and now I'm the leader of my country. He said, I have more children to feed, not only my own, but now I have all my countrymen's children to feed. And when I have all the children fed, then I'll worry about what kind of government I have. And I think that story is really what it's all about in politics and democracy. And we just have to remember that as a nation that is the superpower by any definition, and the only superpower today, certainly we have rivals with economic rivals today, unlike we've had in the past. But the American spirit has always been such that we have risen to the occasion, and the next generation has always basically taken their role and moved forward. The great concern of Americans today, and part of why Americans are most worried, is they're not sure the next generation is going to live as good a life as they have lived, that the America of tomorrow may not be as good as the America of today. Well, I have great confidence in the young people that I've met here and the young people in this room that they will make the next generation and the next America every bit as good as any America. But our political process plays a very, very key role in all of that. And I think the thing that I find most discouraging, absolutely most discouraging, is when I hear young people say they're not going to vote, or they say that it doesn't make a difference, or why are all the people in the political process bad people, or why do we end up with an election that we end up voting for the lesser of 3 evils. It's the only part of America that we don't choose the very best. And there are hundreds and hundreds of very, very good men and women who are in American politics, many in state government, many in the national government. And obviously we have 2 very good men running for president. They're not bad men. And Ross Perot is a 3rd man who's been a great American. He may not be a great presidential candidate, but he's been a great American. And I think that the problem is we have a process that destroys people. We have a process in which we are far more interested in knowing all the unsavory than we are about what is good and positive and productive. And somehow we as citizens have got to respond and react to the negative campaigning. The negative campaigning and the coverage that goes on today is our fault, not their fault. Campaign consultants and candidates use it because it works. And when it doesn't work, when we stand up as Americans and say, no more, the first person that fires the first shot, I'm not going to vote for him, or I'm basically not going to give money to them, then you will find us getting back and talking about issues. I'm just going to close with a thought that I've been an advisor for a number of years to the President of Colombia, And I was recently down there, very young man, a country that obviously has terrible, terrible problems, and obviously an economy that's very dependent on drug use and what have you. And I was down there in February, March of this year, sort of a midterm, and where does the country go? And I found myself obviously talking about strategy and where you should go, and I said, you know, you're being widely criticized in America by the way you're dealing with your criminals here. And he very quickly turned to me and he told me something that I will never forget. He said, the price we have paid fighting drug abuse in America is that, he said, I have had 250 judges murdered. He said, I have had my chief of staff's sister and child kidnapped. Every day I ride in an armored car to move forward. He said, I have had people in law enforcement, thousands of people threatened and killed and murdered and hurt fighting drug abuse in your country. When we sit and we watch CNN, and the world is now all tied together by CNN, and we watch the mayor of the capital of Washington, D.C., who gets convicted of using cocaine, and he gets his wrist slapped and sent to prison for 4 months, it sends a very bad signal to us. So his message was, you guys go back and clean up your own house before you come lecture any of the rest of us. And I think that's the message that I want to give to us today as Americans as we work together. If we're going to continue to be the democracy role model, and obviously we should because we have a system that we believe in, we have a system that works, we have a system that obviously has made us a truly great country, and we have a system that we want to continue to be the role model for the emerging democracies, the torch and the flame of freedom, we've got to be satisfied with it ourselves, and we've got to make it work ourselves. And the only way we're going to make it work ourselves is for us to get active. We should basically, in the next 3 weeks, make anyone we know who's not going to vote feel terribly irresponsible. My attitude is, if you're not going to vote, don't bitch. You've given up your right to bitch, which is one of the world's great rights in this country. If you don't like who's in office, let's go get them out of office. If you don't like who's running for president, let's begin now getting ready for the next cycle. But if we don't feel good about democracy, and particularly the young people, and those of you who are parents, you have an obligation, a moral obligation, to go out and brag to your children about this great citizenship that we have and how we can move our country forward once again, and let's quit feeling sorry for ourselves. I've been in Guatemala. I've been in the Philippines. The richest man on their best day in those countries, I would not trade my worst day in this country for. And I don't mean to cast any aspersions on any of those countries. But we have so much in this country, and when Americans decide they're going to do it, we can do it. Now, obviously, our competitive juices better get ready because whoever the next president, whether Bush gets reelected or Clinton, as is likely, gets reelected, we as Americans, not as partisan Republicans, Democrats, conservative liberals, which we all are in this room, we as Americans have got to make this system work. We've got to make ourselves deal with the issues, we've got to move ourselves forward, and we've got to basically quit feeling sorry for ourselves. Competition always brings out the best in everyone, and now we have a very competitive world today. Instead of talking about what lousy schools we have and how our kids are not going to be able to compete, we can fix our schools. There's nothing that is insurmountable when Americans decide they're going to fix it. And what better time than at a transition, an election period, when it's our greatest freedom, the right to go out and choose our own leaders, our own representation, that we not rethink how we move forward. Thank you for being such a wonderful audience. I'll be happy to respond to any questions anybody might have. Thank you. The question is, what impact will the silent majority have on the race? My sense is silent majorities are polled just like everybody else, and I think the reality is there's a lot of Americans who are frustrated with the system today. They may say they're going to vote for Bill Clinton. They're not totally comfortable with that decision yet. They think George Bush is a nice man, but they don't think he's focused. So my sense in the next 2 or 3 weeks really is going to depend on what kind of a campaign they run. I mean, the smartest thing George Bush could be in the debate on Sunday night would be turn to Bill Clinton and say, Bill, before we start this thing, in my opening remark, I want to apologize to you. I want to apologize to you for my party attacking your wife. I want to apologize to you for attacking what you did 20 years ago. I want to apologize to the citizens of your state And I pledge to you the next 4 weeks, we're going to talk about where this country is going to go. You have a plan, I have a plan. Let's move this thing forward. I think if he did that, people would take a second look at George Bush. If he doesn't, and we end up in this slugfest where everybody's firing for the kneecaps, the American electorate will be so turned off, it'll deprive whoever gets elected of any kind of mandate to govern, and obviously that's not what we need today in this political process. So I think there's a lot of Americans sitting out there who may be the silent majority, who may be frustrated with the system, but first and foremost, they have to make a decision on who they're going to vote for and make sure they vote. Obviously, the Vietnam War was the most divisive modern-day war that this country's ever fought, and there's a lot of still ill will and bad feelings by both those who went and those who didn't go. 82% of the American public said the draft issue is not something that matters to me in this election, and how I'm going to select the next president. All the people that it does matter, I think, are already voting for George Bush. He's made his point. It's just time to move on. Relative to the Japanese, I have a lot of experience with the Japanese. I wrote a political column. It was the most widely American political column in Japan for about 4 or 5 years, sort of American-Japanese relationships. And I sort of would blast them every week, which the more I blasted them, I always assumed it was always a nuisance to write this column. So I figured the more aggressive I got every week, the less likely they would come back and ask me to write it again. But I found the more I blasted them, the more newspapers that get published in. There's a great cultural divide between us and them, and you can't compare the two countries. Americans would not live the way Japanese live. We would not basically pay the exorbitant price of houses that they live in. We wouldn't live in the small houses. We wouldn't live their lifestyle. Our children today need to be better educated, but I don't think you'd get very far to try and put kids in school on Saturdays and go back to 10 or 12-hour day classes. But they are a serious competitor, and I think the critical question we have as a nation is, are we going to let them, when we advocate free trade, are we really going to make sure it's fair trade? And there are great restraints put on our products when they're sold in Japan. They don't let us translate in many cases. We take bottles of wine, you have to put them in cartons. And obviously we can't cut off, and shouldn't cut off, the supply of Japanese goods to this country. But we need to be a little tougher. There's no reason, if they don't treat us fairly, we can't treat them the same way. There's no reason we couldn't inspect every car that comes in this country at the docks in Oakland and say we're going to inspect 10 cars today and that's all we're going to sell. You would quickly find some changes in the pattern of trade. I think that Japan is a country that's going through very, very significant problems. Germany is a country that's going through very significant problems, and we are going through very significant problems. The critical thing, though, is we are still the strongest economy in the world, and somehow Americans, through the leadership, the moral leadership of people like you in this room and our leaders in government, have got to get Americans back on track. We've got to get our system back on track, and we've got to get a little confidence that once again we can do the things that we've always done better. We may have to work harder. We may have to have a little more discipline in our spending habits. We may have to be taxed a little bit more, and we may not have all the benefits we have today coming out of governments. But obviously, this still is the nation that everybody else wants to model itself after. So the question is, the president's popularity has dropped dramatically since the Gulf War, and what to a point where it's at record lows. George Bush's approval rating is today at the level of Richard Nixon at the height of Watergate, Lyndon Johnson at the height of Vietnam, and lower than Jimmy Carter. Now, I personally don't think George Bush deserves to be at that level, but nevertheless, that's where the mood of the country is. Part of what I think has happened to Bush, and as someone that's watched it very closely, is that George Bush is a wonderful retail salesman. George Bush has more friends than anybody ever could possibly have. He is marvelous one-on-one, he writes notes, he makes telephone calls, but he's a lousy wholesale salesman. He doesn't understand the power of television. His strategy relative to the press, which is what your basic question has been, is I'm going to go into the press room and I'm going to hold 3 or 4 press conferences, not in prime time, during the daytime. I'm going to answer all their questions, and therefore they'll be happy with me. When I was involved with Reagan, our attitude was never to make the press happy. We didn't care if they were happy. We wanted to communicate with the American public. So we'd have a press conference at night, limit the questions, talk on 1 or 2 topics, and the American public always felt Reagan was communicating with them. The problem is today is that Bush has communicated with the American news media, and they have in turn interpreted in 30 different ways what it is that he said. He's not done very good PR, not done very good communications. But fundamentally what he has done, though, is that he has misread the problems of the country. And I say this in all fairness to the media and anybody else. The economy has been a problem in this country for a significant period of time. Now, some people can argue the government shouldn't do anything to affect it one way or the other. That's the policy of Secretary Brady. But when you stand up on a day that unemployment is going up, or you stand off a golf cart when you're vetoing an unemployment bill, extension bill, you're not sending a very good message to the American public. And the President basically has not been very effective at communicating to the American public that he understands they have problems. The American public is very fair, even through all the filters of the news media. They have never, ever expected George Bush to have all the answers. They have expected George Bush to understand there are problems. And I think if he goes down to defeat, it'll be because the American public thinks he doesn't understand their problems, let alone doesn't have any solutions for them. If he would have said, I understand this country has serious economic problems, we've got to get Americans back to work, I don't have all the answers today, but together we're going to find the answers. My focus is going to be on these 3 or 4 things in a second term that's going to be different. And obviously I still need to do some things in the international arena because we can't walk away from that, but my focus in a second term is going to be on what's in the best interest of your kids and my grandkids. He'd have been back in the game.